I'm Rabbi Miriam Margles, the rabbi of the Danforth Jewish Circle, and I'm really delighted that we're all here together for a very important conversation. We are gifted, blessed to have a very valuable, wise group of panelists to share their thinking and to respond to questions. Today's panel and discussion is exploring Jewish perspectives on these questions of defunding the police and giving us wider context of the issues in questions. And of course, this conversation is very timely. We are recently past the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, which was not unique in the overt police racism and brutality that caused it, but has been a turning point of reckoning. It has sparked broad public awakening and recognition of racism in policing, and has opened essential conversations and action related to thinking about alternatives to the current policing models here in Toronto, throughout Canada, not just in the United States. This is also a timely conversation as anti-Semitism has been exploding in the past few years, from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh, to the recent explosion of violence and vandalism directed at Jews, Jewish businesses, and organizations. As a Jewish community, we can't think about issues related to defunding the police without taking into account real dangers and concerns related to anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence. And at the same time, based on our Jewish values, we are called upon to hold these concerns in tandem with our obligations to justice, to ending oppression, and therefore to thinking in creative terms and new paradigms for ensuring the safety and well-being of Jews and of people of the global majority as inseparable one from the other. Our panelists will address these complicated threads. As we begin this program, it has become a practice, as I'm sure you all know, to acknowledge the land, the Indigenous history, and the contemporary Indigenous peoples on this land before beginning a program. This is important. We do this not just as lip service. We do this in order for the words of recognition to travel from our mouths, from our ears, into our awareness, our hearts, and extending outward through our actions. This is important, all the more so as we struggle as a nation to face the devastation of the residential school system, colonial oppression, and the ways that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately targeted by police. I speak these words of land acknowledgement as an Ashkenazi Jew whose fairly recent ancestors arrived to this land as settlers. We acknowledge that the land we are on here on Turtle Island is the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Acknowledging the land and its Indigenous peoples is one act in the larger engagement with the work of reconciliation, reconciliation, and justice. May all peoples in this region live and work together, caring for the land and for each other with integrity, dignity, and respect. A final note before we begin. These are difficult conversations. We are all being asked to commit to communicating thoughtfully and with respect, sharing our questions and seeking to understand views, perspectives that may be new for any of us. There will be time for questions after the panelists speak. You are invited to put questions in the chat, and please ask questions seeking to understand. Attack is not appropriate, just to make sure we are all in agreement about that. I now want to turn it over to Anne.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Miriam. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Ann Dunlap, pronouns she, her, hers. I live on Haudenosaunee land, currently known as Buffalo, New York. So I'm waving to the Toronto people from across the lake. I am the faith organizing coordinator for Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ. Two of our guiding priorities as SURJ are abolition and economic justice, towards building a world where everyone is safe and has all that we need to thrive and to flourish. SURJ-Faith, the faith program, has contributed to that in part through our Community Safety for All campaign, which we began in 2017. And last year, thanks to the uprisings for Black life here in the United States that opened up whole new possibilities for conversation and work around what kind of a world we actually want to be a part of and live in, and how defunding police and abolition are part of that world, we launched our Community Safety for All toolkit for congregations who want to explore and take action to stop relying on police and build alternative practices instead. And I want to say that in this work, Jewish folks have actually taught me so much as a Christian about what true safety, what true community safety actually means. So I'm grateful and honored to be part of this conversation today with you and to facilitate this panel of wonderful people that we've brought together. Briefly, our panelists today are Rima Berns-McGown, a member of the Provincial Parliament for Beaches, East York. Hannah Freedman, a member of Kavod Boston here in the US, and one of the leaders of their community safety team. And Carin, Mrotz, the executive director of Jewish Community Action in Minneapolis. We're thankful to each one of you for being able to join us today. So let's dive right in. We have three major questions we're going to be asking our panelists, and then we'll finish out that panel section with some ways that folks joining us today can begin to take action. So our first question is, what do we mean by defunding the police? What do we mean when we say that? And to our panelists, why do each of you support it, and why should Jewish folks support defunding the police? So Hannah, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Anne, and thank you everyone for having me. It's really special to be here, and I hope that you're all having a good Sunday. Okay, I'll take a first crack at this and then pass it on. Defunding the police, to me, means redistributing the public money that is in city budgets away from police departments and towards community services like housing, education, community centers, support for people experiencing homelessness, and everything else that people need. I have been living in Boston, but actually just moved back to Baltimore, Maryland, which is where I'm from. And here in Baltimore, the Baltimore Police Department receives a little over $500 million every year in the annual budget, which is 3 times the combined amount proposed for housing and community development, economic development, homeless services, recreation and parks, arts and culture, health, and like civil rights. So it's just like 3 times the amount of all of the rest of the city budget is going towards the police. And I think defunding the police can like often feel a little scary until we remember, actually, we've been like defunding other civil services for the last like 50 years. So it's about redistributing the public money in city budgets away from police departments, but it's also then about redistributing the responsibilities that are held by police departments into like other people's jobs so that the police aren't responsible for so many things. It's also like, what if we had, it's also like about the imagination, right? So it's like, what if we had licensed mental health providers responding to mental health crises, or instead of being like pulled over and ticketed when the taillight of your car is out and you're driving, there was someone who just like let you know and who helped you replace the bulb in the taillight of your car. It didn't like give you a ticket. It's like that, when we think on that level, it's like, that's actually what safety is. Like that person just made driving around like safer for everyone because like you had your taillight replaced and like nobody was shot. So it's like making it safer for people to be around that doesn't require a gun or like militarized force. And defunding the police also fits within like the wider framework of police and prison abolition, which is about really like getting to the root of policing and prison problem and like dreaming up alternatives together. So much of crime happens because people don't have access to the things that they need, and the police and prison problem just kind of like attacks the like the results of the problem instead of like the core root of things. And that when we invest in communities and like have community resources to make sure that folks have access to what they need, crime goes down. The safest communities are the ones that like have access to the most resources. And it's also just that like the systems, I believe in it also because like the systems that we have today just like don't work. It's like if policing and jails and prisons like actually meant safer communities, the US should be a lot safer than it is right now. That's kind of like the foundation work, and I'll pass it over to Carin.
Thanks, Hannah. That was awesome. So I would echo what Hannah said. What this looks like here in Minnesota and here in Minneapolis. So for Jewish Community Action, we organize Jews in Minnesota for racial and economic justice. And so our Minneapolis members have been working literally for years to defund the police, and we've just not called it that explicitly. Every year when the mayor proposes a budget that increases our police force by so many hundred number of positions, our members faithfully trot out to a city council meeting and testify that actually we don't want more police, we want things like supportive housing. And we've always done this explicitly in support of other things, like whether it's housing or mental health services. Last year, when George Floyd was murdered, just a couple miles from where I'm sitting, this took on a different sense of urgency, partly because I think we were seeing that Minneapolis Police Department is not reformable. And also there just seemed to be a moment where a lot more people were listening and paying attention. And it really exploded the conversation a bit more publicly in Minneapolis. And a coalition specifically focused on defunding the Minneapolis Police Department formed. What defunding looks like in Minneapolis right now is actually an ordinance. When we talk about defunding the police and moving money from the police department to other types of things, our city charter actually prohibits us from doing that to a certain extent. It actually requires, our city charter requires a certain number of police officers per capita for Minneapolis. And so we have an election in November. Our coalition, we are called Yes for Minneapolis. And our coalition has put an ordinance on the ballot. We had to collect about 20,000 signatures to get it on the ballot. That was a little tricky because the signatures need to be done in person, and in a pandemic, it was a little tricky, but we did it, which I think is evidence of the really strong grassroots support for doing this. And so we have an ordinance on the ballot in November. And what it says is that right now our city charter says we have a standalone police department that reports to the mayor. What our charter amendment would do is create a Department of Public Safety, which would then include all kinds of other holistic public safety things and licensed peace officers, which are police. So in Minneapolis, defunding the police right now is not an ask for abolition. The ordinance that we're asking folks to vote on specifically names that if needed, we will maintain some police force. Because I think what we're trying to do is identify that there is a spectrum of folks in our community, and there's a spectrum of needs. And we're really much more invested in, like Hannah said, what are those other things, right? Like what are those other things that we could be funding and we could be doing if we weren't spending these huge portions of our municipal budgets on policing. And I would say that similarly to what Hannah said, that's kind of how we think of this. I mean, that's how we're thinking of abolition is, a lot of people say, well, you're trying to take away our police. What we're actually trying to do is say, what else could there be, right? That abolition is a presence. It's not an absence. It's not taking away the police. It's what could we build if we freed up all of these resources to actually imagine what else there could be in our city if we weren't spending like this much of the pie on this one department. So that's what it looks like on the ground in Minneapolis right now.
Okay, well, I guess I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Hannah and Carin and Anne. and Rabbi Miriam and all of the Danforth Jewish Circle. It's a real honor to be with you here today. Thanks for spending part of a beautiful Sunday afternoon. What you folks in the States may not recognize is that patios have just opened. So people are like newly liberated from very long lockdowns. And so it says so much for this very important and courageous conversation that so many dozens of people have decided to spend it here and are not on a patio this afternoon. I want to I want to talk about Toronto, but I actually want to start a little bit by saying something about my family history, which I actually think is relevant to the conversation that we want to have here today. So I was born in South Africa. I come from a racially mixed background. 3 of my 4 grandparents were Jewish, and my 4th grandparent, my father's mom, was Cape colored as well as Afrikaner, and converted to Judaism via an Orthodox conversion to marry my grandfather. The 3 grandparents who were Jewish had all come, their families had all come from Europe escaping persecution. My father's father had to run away from home at the age of 12 years old with his 13-year-old brother somewhere in the Russian Empire in order to escape being snatched into the Tsar's army, which would have been a life sentence. And so he and his, like literally at the age of 12, still a child, he and his 13-year-old brother lit out from home, made their way eventually westward. Much farther down the line, my grandfather was then born in Manchester. Along the way, they changed their name to Bernstein. So the Burns in my name used to be Bernstein, until they ran into severe, my grandfather ran into severe anti-Semitism in South Africa, having finally scratched his way up from being a peddler of eyeglasses to having a little shop that was getting bashed by and constantly broken by the South African police because he had a Jewish name on it. And in the case of my mother's grandfather, he had been, he was in Prussia and actually ended up for the crime of trying to keep his family safe, shoved into a jail that he would have rotted away in for the rest of his life if his mother hadn't gone to the jailers and said, you know, tomorrow is Yom Kippur, can you just let him out for 24 hours? Here's some food. And of course they did, and he ran and didn't stop running until he hit the Karua, which is a sort of semi-arid desert in South Africa. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that all of my family has been deeply affected by police forces and armies whose safety was not, who were not holding Jews in their hearts when they thought about safety. Safety was not for Jews. It was for Afrikaners, it was for Christians, it was for Russians, it was for Poles, it was not for Jews. So when we think about this issue that is coming to the fore now in our very diverse societies that we live in the United States and Canada, and one of the points, of course, I've made is that although the question of relationships with Black and Indigenous people have not played out exactly the same way in the United States that they have in Canada, there is still enormous histories of violence and murder and control. And police forces and at all levels of government have histories that were about controlling Indigenous peoples in Canada and Black people in Canada from the very founding of the settler colonial apparatuses and states. So it's really, really important to bear all of that in mind when we're having these complicated conversations. And then I think the other thing that I want to say is we can get very wrapped up in the idea that, oh my goodness, no, this is about taking away our safety. And that's why I think it's important to think about the language that we're using and what is actually going on. And as Hannah and Carin have been discussing, and Reverend Ann was referring to, what we're really trying to do is extend safety to everyone, because everyone deserves to feel safe. And just because Jews who are white, because some Jews of course are not, just because Jews who are white tend to feel comfortable with police presences at this moment in these places in history doesn't mean that that's enough. We need everybody to be safe. And so we have to really examine, what does safety mean and how do we get there? And if we have institutions that are not providing that safety, what do we do to get to that safety? What does that mean? What has to happen? What kind of restructuring of our society has to happen? And then finally, of course, we have limited public resources, because that's just how things work. We don't have an infinite number of public resources. And so when we're spending the lion's share of our public resources in this one way that is actively, and there are all the statistics to show it, oppressing parts of our population, number one, that means that there are fewer tax dollars and public resources there for things like housing and good education, and making sure that we have those opportunities that allow everyone to flourish. And that we don't have the orientation that we need. And the beauty of that abolitionist orientation, and give it another name if it helps you to talk about it, but the beauty of that orientation is it says we shouldn't be structuring our society in a way that is extremely punitive, sets up barriers so that only some of us are capable of thriving, and then has the way it works is that if you step a toe out of line because you're not thriving, that then you're set on this path that sends you behind bars and that ruins your entire life. Like, that doesn't make any sense. If instead of that we created an environment in which everybody could thrive and we broke down barriers to thriving, we would end up with much happier, healthier societies. And sort of, so the idea is more that these prisons and these punitive ways of thinking would kind of wither away as you nurture people rather than seek to punish them for structural things they didn't have any control over in the first place.
Beautiful. Thank you to each of you for your wonderful responses to those questions. And as we shift towards the second question, I want to just draw our attention to Rima's point of how the police were not actually interested in keeping anyone safe. The police weren't interested in keeping your great-grandparents safe. They aren't interested in keeping Black people safe. They aren't interested in keeping Indigenous people safe. And so the learning there for us is that safety is not the reason why policing exists. In Canada, in the United States, those roots are very similar. And so how might we reimagine what safety looks like collectively? And in drawing that learning for us, all three of you, it speaks to the connection between racism, because policing enforces racism, and also anti-Semitism. And so the second question is to ask you to speak to that connection, that link between racism and anti-Semitism, and why fighting racism and fighting anti-Semitism go hand in hand. And Carin, I'm actually going to ask you to start us off, because you wrote a really beautiful piece about this not so long ago that was actually what prompted us to invite you onto this panel. So if you could please speak to the question and then just hand it to whoever feels like should go next.
Thank you. It's a really big question. Yeah, I mean, look, it's really clear that anti-Semitism and racism, by which I'll just explicitly say anti-Blackness, work together in the machinery of white supremacy. And what we see is this intentional division of folks and communities who could be and should be allies, and are often just pitted against each other and don't know each other and are not in relationship. You know, it's not new. I think it's become pretty effectively wielded in the last number of years. And as I think about, I'll just talk about, as I think about this conversation about policing specifically and safety and security in the Jewish community, there's this thing that happens where there are Jews of color and Black Jews in our Jewish community. I have Black Jews on the JCA staff. And one of the things that happened, there's two things that happened. One is, and I just had a conversation with somebody in response to that article that you were naming, Reverend Ann, who was asking me specifically about Black anti-Semitism. There's a unique anti-Semitism from the Black community, and what do you think about that? How can you say that anti-Semitism is part of white supremacy when it's exhibited by people who are not white? And I think that first of all, it's a remarkable it's a remarkable way of just ignoring the fact that white supremacy culture is the base and the norm in American culture, regardless of who we are as individuals, and that we've all been raised in the same white supremacist construct. And I also, what I asked that person, I kind of rephrased it, and I said, there is racism in the Jewish community. I think we can say that, like we can identify that. Would we say that there's a specifically Jewish type of racism? Like, I don't think so. I think that we are all operating within systems. I do think that sometimes we are most wounded when we experience oppression from other people who we perceive as being oppressed. We all think that other people who experience racism, phobia should, how could you ever enact that on somebody else? And again, we've all been raised in the same culture. I think we can be more generous with one another there. But I think one of the ways that this shows up in the Jewish communities and these conversations that I've been a part of a number of them, I've been on a number of, I've watched a number of panels where there's this framing around security in synagogues where we acknowledge that security and armed police or armed security makes Black Jews and Jews of color feel unsafe in shul. And we say that, we name it. And then we pivot to, but the rest of us, or the entire community at large, needs protection from white supremacist violence that we might experience. And what's happening in these conversations is we're pitting the fears and perceptions of Black Jews and Jews of color against the real need for physical safety for the rest of the community. We are taking and I want to say two things. One is that actually fear is a physical thing that happens in our bodies. And I think it's okay to name that and to talk about what happens when we're triggered by fear, and how often we're not just responding to what's happening in the moment, but we're responding to centuries of epigenetic trauma and stories. But also that when we are pitting people's feelings against other people's real safety, this is a conversation we can't have. Like, we've created a zero-sum game between members of our community, and we're doing it rhetorically in order to say, what can we do? It's like, you feel afraid, but we are in real physical danger. How can we even have a conversation? We can't. And so we throw our hands up and we kick the can down the road, and we do a bunch of, educational programming. And then we still have armed security in our shuls. And so I do think that one of the ways that I see this intersection is that I think that it is racism that causes us to treat the real physical danger that Black Jews and Jews of color are in as their fears and perceptions, rather than as a physical reality. We are shortchanging this conversation, and we're making real physical danger about some people's feelings as a way to avoid having a much more challenging conversation. And then I want to go to Rima next.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is so important. So first of all, I think the thing that we have to bear in mind is that the rise in anti-Semitism that is so terrifying, that results in real concerns for safety in synagogues and for people's safety as human beings, comes from exactly the same source as the violence that police forces inflict upon Black and Indigenous and other people of color, and whether they're Jewish or not. And that is exactly this white supremacy. And so there's multiple meanings to white supremacy. And what I mean by white supremacy is just the idea that whiteness and Christianity is the default normal. That is, which is separate from the sort of right-wing hate, but connected to it. So people who would never ever think of lifting a fist against anyone or wouldn't call someone a nasty word, nonetheless hold this idea that whiteness is the default normal. That is white supremacy. That is at the root of all of the evil that we have to get rid of here. And one of the ways that it manifests is in this extreme right-wing hate, which then lashes out and affects Jews of all colors, as well as Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color. And so we all face the same monster, and we all have to work together to slay it. And that means that you cannot get rid of, eliminate, attack anti-Semitism if you are not also getting rid of every other kind of oppression on the planet. Like, they all have to go, and you have to understand, we have to understand that our safety is inextricably linked with the safety, security, and ability to thrive of every other person on the planet. And so what kind of shifts in thinking that does that take? That's what we really have to then wrestle with. Thanks so much. And over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Rima and Carin. So smart, so smart, so smart. Honestly, the only thing to add is I would just like to share like about how I first learned about anti-Semitism as like a theory, because I think when it was explained to me in this way, like a lot of other things kind of got connected for me. And a lot of my framing for this comes from April Rosenblum, if folks are familiar with her, and like a zine pamphlet that was created a bunch of years ago called The Past Didn't Go Anywhere. And basically she just explains and frames anti-Semitism as kind of like an emergency brake for capitalism. And so like when capitalism is doing the thing, creating wealth disparity, and people are starting to like connect the dots and say like, hey, why do we have billionaires when people are homeless and starving? Like, what's going on here? Anti-Semitism can kind of like come out as like a last tool in the toolbox to create a scapegoat and say like, don't look at this system over here. The system is functioning like just as it's supposed to be functioning. Actually, it's the Jews' fault. It's just like a few bad apples in this system that are like making this happen and are making you like suffer like this. And creating a scapegoat like that is, of course, like bad for the Jews, but also it's like bad for everyone because it really distracts us and helps us like not target the actual systems that are at play that are like causing these dynamics. And so I think that when I like think about anti-Semitism like that, I really like put it into context, and I'm like, just like Rima said, it's like you can't take out anti-Semitism without also taking out racism and white supremacy. And I think that it's also helpful to be like really clear about noticing when we're seeing anti-Semitism used like this, and the ways that we see it used as like a divide and conquer strategy by the right to say like Jews are over here and like people of color and people who are fighting for economic equality are like over here. And it just like divides coalitions. It's used to just like neutralize like progressive non-Jewish leaders by saying, like, especially leaders of color, by saying like, oops, like they're anti-Semitic, like that's a clear card, like don't deal with them anymore. And just like stall our coalitions out before they really even get started. And April just posted like another article, maybe like last week, which was also really good. Maybe someone else could drop that in the chat. And she has a couple sentences in there that I really was relating to that I'd like to read, which is that the world really needs Jews to lead on anti-Semitism and to do it from a perspective of collective liberation. And for Jews who are white, it's like weaving leadership on anti-Semitism into a daily and sustained commitment to Black liberation, which is an act of fuller and deeper responsibility. Thank you.
Can I add one thing? This is the other thing I would add is that, you know, one of the ways that we talk about, this is where I see kind of anti-Semitism and racism playing off each other sometimes in the Jewish community. One of the ways that we talk, at least here in Minnesota, is about that the path to safety is about relationships with law enforcement, right? So there's this acknowledgement that whether it is, you know, ancient or recent, like Rima named earlier, law enforcement has rarely been like the friend to the Jews. And the way that it's talked about here in the establishment Jewish community is that we need to have relationships with law enforcement. We need to know who are our people, right? And I think that speaks to a comfort level with whiteness that Jews and white Jews specifically have gotten to, that we're at the place where, oh, we have relationships with law enforcement. And a really smart person who I learned a lot about anti-Semitism from once told me that when we are injured in our place of weakness, we often just reactively respond from our place of strength or the place where we perceive our strength. And so I think sometimes when Jews are harmed by anti-Semitism, which is our own self-identified point of weakness, we respond by grabbing the strongest, most powerful tool that we perceive we have, which is proximity to whiteness. And so when we are targeted by anti-Semitism and we are afraid, we reach for the thing we've got, which is relationships with law enforcement. And that's kind of a key way that I see this playing out in our community.
Thank you. Thanks. That's such great responses, One of the things I hope folks are hearing from these responses to this question is that part of that link between racism and anti-Semitism is around safety. And what true safety means is the dismantling of both racism and anti-Semitism. And we won't get to a world of true safety for everyone without doing both of those things. And our third question is about that we all want to live in a world where everyone is safe and loved. And as I said in the beginning, that we have all that we need to thrive and to flourish. And we take really seriously the safety and thriving of Jewish communities. I know all of you do, and we certainly do at SURJ and at SURJ-Faith. So what are some non-policing alternatives? You might be asking yourself, well, if we don't call the cops, then what do we do instead? Like, what are some of those alternatives for safety and well-being that Jewish communities can practice? And I think, Rima, it's your turn to go first now. And just to remind everyone, if you have questions that are coming up, that time in the agenda is coming, so you can pop those in the chat while you're also listening to our fabulous presenters.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dan. And I just want to say what a huge honor it is to be on a panel with, these incredibly smart women. Like, just amazing to listen and to be able to amplify each other's ideas, because I think this is really crucial. So one of the things that's come up a lot is that frequently police are asked to do things that they're not very good at doing. They're just not good at going and helping people out when they're having a mental health crisis. I mean, they're not always good at helping people when their rear taillights aren't working either, but they're not good at helping people who are having a mental health crisis. So we could absolutely be putting in teams of people. And I think that some of the thinking is starting to go there. Like, there are teams of people that can be called to help in a mental health crisis, so that folks with guns never show up, because if somebody is having a mental health crisis, and particularly if they're a Black or otherwise racialized person, seeing somebody come with a gun or teams of people coming with a gun doesn't calm them down. It often has the opposite effect. And of course, we find that that turns lethal within nanoseconds. And it's horrific. And then we get into that whole cycle that we want to get away from. The other thing that I've been hearing about recently is issues of neighbor disputes. And there's one that's been happening in my neighborhood, in my community, where racism seems to be involved. And again, the police are singularly terribly equipped to deal with this. There is no way for them to manage a neighbor. They don't like neighbor disputes anyway. And this is a neighbor dispute where racism is a thing, but the police can't see that it's a thing, and everything is just continuing to escalate. If there were other ways of dealing with neighbor disputes. So there's so much that where the police can be just taken out of the equation. So it doesn't have to even be a confrontational thing. It's just that when we need other resources to be available. And so the sorts of community supports that Jewish communities might be able to have in place, so that there might be layers of things there that you can turn to before you turn to this, as Carin so very thoughtfully said, this proximity to whiteness, which is the stand-in for the police, is so important. And I think too, before I stop talking, that I want to say that, like, a crucial thing to get there is this conversation and conversations like it. Because until people really understand what is it we're trying to do, what is it we're really talking about, that there aren't these zero-sum games that sometimes are imagined, the fear and trauma leads us to, we can't get to the place where we can start to imagine what kinds of restorative justice circles or resources to calm everything down, or just circles of other community members to stand outside perhaps our services while they're happening. So that sometimes when folks in mosques have been hurt, then Jews have gone to stand outside the mosque to keep them safe. And sometimes that's happened the other way, when Christians and Muslims have stood outside synagogues when Jews have been praying. So that kind of help that we can give each other, that's so much more powerful and in line with our morals and ethics and where we're trying to get to as moral people, I think. Okay, Hannah, what about you?
Thanks, Rima. I guess I'll just start by explaining a little bit about Kavod and the community safety team, which I probably should have done at the top of this workshop. So thank you for your patience. Kavod is a Jewish community in Boston that is like layperson led and is like running on a collective model. We don't have like a building, like a synagogue. We just like meet in different like public places or in members' houses. And it is both like a spiritual and an organizing home for young Jews in the Boston area. And when we run High Holy Days services, we use like a synagogue space at like a much larger synagogue in Boston. And for years, one of the requirements of leading services and using their space was that we had either police or private security forces as part of our like rental agreement with this synagogue. And one of our like beloved Kavod leaders of color kind of like started by having the conversation of talking to the shul about like, is the requirement to have armed security like totally the same thing, or could we have like alternative forms of community safety and security at this event? And we got permission from them to do like a trial year. And what we did was we like ran de-escalation and community safety trainings and trained up about 100 Jewish and non-Jewish like neighbors and other community organizers in the Boston area in how to show up and do community safety for High Holy Days. And that has kind of become like a tradition. And in the last 5 years of community safety, in the last 5 years of High Holy Days events that Kavod has put on, we have had trained community members doing community safety and de-escalation and event safety at High Holy Days events. And last year, I guess 2 years ago, not including COVID year, we had enough folks trained up that we were able to offer that for other Jewish communities in the Boston area if they wanted to like use some of these folks that we had trained up as some community safety at their events. And it's kind of like bubbled out from there. And we, at this point, regularly run de-escalation and community safety workshops, which basically just like are like 2 hours. They're run by folks who have like longer term training in how to do safety, and basically train people in how to respond in different crises that could arise during an event. And in addition to having like trained volunteers who are down to do that, we also have been supporting congregations and organizations in creating a community safety plan for their organization. And I saw a question in the chat about like active shooter situations, which is like far and away the most common question that we get when we're talking about community safety, because that feels like the like big central fear for folks. But when we break it down, it's like that's also actually a pretty unlikely scenario compared to all of the other things that make people unsafe in a situation. And so a lot of what the community safety plan is like, okay, like if someone like falls and breaks their ankle, like who do we talk to about that? Like, where are the fire extinguishers? Like, who's the chain of command? Like, who would have the key to like this building that we might need in this case? And so it's really getting down to the details of like, what are some scenarios that could happen and what would we want to have in place in order for us to be able to react in the ways that we want to when that happens. And in my experience, it's also such a balm for my anxiety, my very Jewish anxiety, to like have some plans in place for like different scenarios. And also just the action of like creating a community safety plan together collectively as an organization or as a congregation also just helps people have the conversations of like, what does safety mean? Like, what would actually make you feel safer in your congregation? Like, yeah, and that has also been like one of the most powerful parts about doing this work. I think just in general, like the main thing that has felt the most powerful is what it means as a Jewish person to ask non-Jewish folks to show up in solidarity with us. It's like a really hard, but also really powerful thing. And knowing that I was like at High Holy Day services and that there were like non-Jewish like friends from organizations like the Muslim Justice League, like the Asian American Resource Workshop, who were there, who were like standing and looking out for like me and my people's safety, was really a really powerful experience. And I'm happy to, Kavod has also like created a bunch of resources, like a template for a organizational community safety plan, and some guides for like how to start those conversations in your synagogue, Sunday school, whatever, that I would also be happy to share with folks after this.
Yeah, I would amplify what Rima and Hannah said and just add like two hands-on experiences with this. You know, like I said earlier, the baseline in our Jewish community here in Minnesota is that, you know, safety is about having relationships with law enforcement. JCA prefers to ask, who do we already have relationships with that we could reach out to for safety and security? And so we have worked with the Teamsters. I mean, like, we have a lot of like friends in the labor movement who do this. And, you know, so when we've had annual meetings and we've had a reason to believe that somebody might come and try to disrupt it, we've reached out to the Teamsters, and they're happy to hang out in the parking lot of the JCC with their big truck that says like the Teamsters. You know, often I think that's what we're looking for, is we're looking for some like strong looking people to just stand around the entrance and deter somebody from coming in. You know, we also have relationships with the Service Employees International Union, who represents security workers, and who have often been like happy to come and provide non-police security at our events for us. And so often for us, it's less about having a relationship with law enforcement and more about like, who do we already have relationships with who could add a layer of doing security in a way that, like Hannah said, feels like we have allies, you know, rather than just guards. The other thing is that, you know, here in Minneapolis, after Minneapolis police murdered George Floyd, there was about a week of uprising. And in my neighborhood, in North Minneapolis, there weren't protests or what some folks are calling riots, but there were, whether they were white supremacists or just instigators, there were just folks setting fires and creating some chaos. And we, number one, as neighbors, felt really invested in not engaging the police just days after they had murdered George Floyd. And to be honest, they weren't showing up. The folks that were calling the police were not getting answers. The fire department also didn't want to come here. They were like, well, we're just not really sure it's safe to send our guys out there. And my city council member coordinated online with Google Sheets shifts of neighbors to be at local businesses and to do just patrols and drive up and down the block. And there were a couple of occasions where businesses were set on fire in our neighborhood, and our neighbors just put it out. They had hoses and buckets, and they were just chasing people away and putting out fires. So I think often you can reach out to the people who are around you and just do some coordinating. And I agree with what Hannah said, that the act of putting together a community-based safety plan is actually like a really wonderful thing for a community to undertake. I know a bunch of my neighbors so much better now because we were sitting up all night and driving around in like a tiny Hyundai chasing away like the 3%ers in trucks from our neighborhood. So,
and I guess I just would like to add that it sends, when we're thinking about this whole question of how do we politically start to shift so that we're moving resources away from this fundamentally kind of harmful place where they now exist into places where they're being invested in community to help community and to help community thrive. What a powerful thing for synagogues to do. What a powerful thing for Jewish organizations to do in all the ways. So it doesn't need to be a confrontation. There will be confrontations at city budget time in city halls. There will be confrontations where people go, we want this reduced, and other people are like, we don't, and all of that stuff. But simply when the demand is, we don't want those folks keeping us safe. We want other mechanisms in place, keeping us safe, and really advocating for those. That's a very powerful thing for Jewish organizations to be doing.
Gosh, I like have chills listening to the three of you speak so eloquently in response to this question. And I would just add that our Community Safety for All toolkit has a lot of the resources that all three of you have referred to. I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. A lot of the resources that Hannah in particular referred to are in this toolkit, because Hannah was key in making sure that this toolkit really spoke to the particular needs of Jewish communities to know that they could be safe in doing this work. And so again, thank you, Hannah, for your contributions and Kavod's contributions to that. Different kinds of alternatives are there and scenarios, and you all helped us think through scenarios. So I share that also with everyone here as a response to this question. Our final question is really more of a request, and then we'll get to the questions you all have from our audience. I don't know if that's the right word, audience, I guess. Everybody else who's not a panelist, who's asking questions. And the final one for the panelists is really about action. So having heard all of this, and maybe it's working on us in some deep ways, maybe we're asking, well, what do we do now? What kinds of actions can we take? And so we've asked each of our panelists to offer one action item that you can take with you from today. So I don't know who should start first. Hannah, why don't you go first?
I think that my one action item would be to ask each person here to commit to having a conversation with someone in your life about what safety means to you. And I'll pass it to Rima.
Okay, fair enough. I think that I would actually like to also ask everybody to commit to having conversations about this, particularly to people who they sense might be uncomfortable with it. I'm going to ask you to commit to a courageous conversation. And I actually want to pick up on a point that Bob Bernstein has put in the chat, because I think it's really important. I think a lot of the issue is, what wording are we using to talk about this? And for some people in community, using the wording of defunding and abolition is actually important. But for other people, it's more of a, it triggers fear, which is then preventing them from doing the understanding that we've all been talking about here today. And so sometimes finding different ways to talk about it is actually much more useful. And it's interesting because somebody else here has asked if, I guess it was Ken, who's asked if we could mention the question of policing in Indigenous First Nations. One of my colleagues, the MPP for Kuwaitanang, which is in Northern Ontario, which is a lot of 70-odd fly-in First Nations, and he himself is Indigenous and went to residential schools and has had, you know, some terrible experiences. And I was listening just a couple of nights ago. We had to have an all-night session at Queen's Park, the legislature, and he was talking again very eloquently about the way that he sees colonialism played out over and over and over again on Indigenous peoples and First Nations, and the government not being willing to do anything about it and playing jurisdictional ping pong with the feds and so on and so forth. One of the points that he's made is that talking about even defunding in First Nations isn't necessarily helpful for people, because they want more Indigenous people to help keep them safe. Safety for them is Indigenous folks with Indigenous ways of knowledge and understanding helping to keep them safe. So the term itself can be confusing for people. So sometimes we need different ways of talking about it. I think what's more important is like getting the idea across that we need this transfer of resources into nurturing rather than punishing people. And that's a really crucial thing. And I think if everybody here could commit to going out and having some, at least one, if not 10 courageous conversations with folks who you think might misunderstand this question, that would be awesome. And over to you, Carin.
Yeah, I would add, I totally got wrapped up in what Rima was saying, and I had to think, what was the question? The question was about action steps. Yeah, same. I think that, like I had this conversation, my sister's not an abolitionist. My sister's a pretty like moderate, middle of the road Democrat person who said to me, but like, what would we do? Like, what would happen if somebody broke into your house in the middle of the night and there was no one to call? And I actually sat with her and had a 20-minute conversation and talked about some of the things that Hannah named, like the way that we criminalize driving with a broken taillight rather than just, help people fix their taillights. And what is the reason that we're ticketing people with broken taillights and collecting money from them? Like, what is that about? And had this conversation with my sister. And by the end of the conversation, she was like, okay, I totally get it. Now I need to figure out how to get involved in my community. And I think there's a we all get very set in our ways. And I think just taking the time to slow down and have that conversation with somebody and express that point of view, but without letting up on that there is actually something better possible for us, right? I think there's a lot of calls to we need unity, we need people to like reach across to each other. We do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to abandon your values or abandon what you really believe. As somebody who's working on a campaign to defund the police, I will also just address that. I had a conversation with one of our JCA members a few weeks ago where he started with defunding is, you should know defunding is terrible messaging. And I would say a few things. I would say like, it is both true and frustrating that we have like an 8-minute news cycle. And that the terms that we use, whether they're good or bad, will also be manipulated and weaponized by our enemies to defeat our work. And there is actually not something that we can do to inoculate ourselves from that. There's not actually perfect messaging that we can create that will keep people from engaging in bad faith attacks or from spinning things against us. And so I do just want to name that while I do think that like defunding is a word that freaked a lot of people out, there's not actually a magical way to brand this or name this that won't lend itself similarly to fighting us on it. If folks if folks are in opposition, they will find they'll find their way. And those are things that the campaign is absolutely grappling with. And like, we're in the midst of like hiring really good comms and messaging people to get folks from, what does defunding mean, to actually sitting and having a real conversation and having that conversation. So I think it's like valid and frustrating. And the one thing that I said to my member was, I do just want to name that we've spent the first 15 minutes of this conversation wordsmithing defund and having a really in-depth conversation about how that was a bad word choice and activists are shooting ourselves in the foot and all of those things. Let's get to the part where we talk about what this is about, right? So I think that your reaction, was it Bob? I think your reaction is totally real and totally legitimate. And also like, what does it mean to get to the place where we say, okay, now that said, like, how are we moving forward together in service of this thing that I actually think we agree on more than I think we do. So.
And I would agree with that. If I can just add, like, I agree with that, which is why I think that the more we have these conversations, the more we can, use a shorthand that doesn't then trigger people one way or another, whatever that shorthand is that ends up getting landed on. And,
We've sort of shifted, thank you, all of you. And we've sort of shifted now into the Q&A because we've now started kind of addressing some of the questions that have come up in the chat, which is great. I'm curious, Hannah, if you also have a response to the question about the language of defunding and abolition being divisive or being a turnoff. And I have an opinion about that, which is that they would find any reason to try to shut down conversation. And the reality of what happened is, if it had not been for the insistence on that language, we would not be here today having this conversation. We would not have made the movements that we have made. So there is also something happening around, look how divisive it is, as to sort of invisibilize the fact that it's actually made much more possible in terms of building a safer world. So that's my 2 cents on that. And I will Hannah, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Reverend Ann. And I'll also just say that I choose to like believe in and follow like the work of visionary Black organizers who are like really leading this movement. And if that's the messaging that they have chosen, I'm all in. Like it's like I think that defunding the police and abolition work is just like really, really visionary work in that we are trying to do something without where we're like building the road as we walk on it. Where like we don't have all the answers for like what it's going to look like when we've abolished the police and we've abolished prisons. But I do think that really strong messaging like defund helps the movement stay really clear and really strong on like what the objectives are, and that it's just so easy for things to become like watered down or like put in this way, neutralized in this way, and that being clear on our messaging and maybe having messaging that's like 10 years like in the future, like 20 years in the future, actually helps us get there instead of like appealing to what people are ready for right now. That this is just like visionary work and we're like going faster than we get.
I think it's really important for people to understand that it isn't a slogan, it's a strategy for a fundamental change in the way that society operates. So that to me is the key piece. It's not just a slogan, it's a fundamental shift from the ground up.
Yes, I think that's right, Rima. And I think that that's a good transition to another question that came up in the chat, which I think is about both kind of the roots and the current impact of policing. This is kind of a three-part question. So I don't know, maybe each of you could take a section of this or something and how you figure out how to respond. But could you please talk about policing and Indigenous First Nations, and is this pronounced Métis? I'm not Canadian, so I'm not entirely sure. Métis people and our place, Métis people and our place as settlers who benefit from stolen land and resources. So policing and Indigenous people and settlers. B, policing and environmental protest and the impact on Indigenous people in the climate crisis. And then thirdly, C, police and LGBTQ and two-spirit oppression. Those are great questions. Who would like to start us off?
Well, I'm happy to start with the first one. And I guess what I'd say is that it's really important to understand that the effect of police on Indigenous people in Canada has been as dire as it has been for Black people. If you look at our prisons, they are massively disproportionately Black and Indigenous, like way out of proportion to the number of Black and Indigenous people who live here. And that is not an accident. And it happens because of over surveillance, and it happens because of ongoing settler colonial violence. And it happens because it's intended to happen that way. And I'm the critic for poverty and homelessness as well. And if you look at the populations of people experiencing homelessness, they are also massively disproportionately Black and Indigenous. And that's for the same sets of reasons. And so it's the whole way that the quote unquote justice, the criminal justice system functions at the moment is to again punish, not help people recover from or intergenerational trauma and structural issues that keep them in poverty and keep them from thriving. So the police forces as well in Canada, throughout Canada, at all level, began with the whole idea that you pushed Indigenous peoples off of their land or into a very small corner of their land, and then you didn't allow them to leave, and you thoroughly control their movements, the idea of the Indian agent. And so this is actually where policing came from in this country. And so the very core of it is to continue to act that way. And so what we have also found is that trying to reform that at the edges does not work. So we need a completely different system of safety.
I would love to follow you, Rima, and just say, I think whenever we talk about policing and public safety, it's extremely important to name where we are. I mean, as I'm talking, as my ketubah says on the wall in the next room, I'm talking to you from traditional Dakota and Anishinaabe land, because often when we're talking about safety and policing, what we're talking about is the protection of property rather than people and rather than lives. And I think it's important to name that the property we're protecting is sitting on land stolen by people who are still here, or from people who are still here. And I want to speak to the B about environmental protests, because currently there are water protectors up in northern Minnesota. I know, Hannah, I think you were just here last weekend. And it is such a tremendous example of how police are wielded to protect property rather than people, because in fact, Enbridge, a giant corporation, is funding police to protect the pipeline. Enbridge has been funneling money to county sheriff's offices in Minnesota in order to hire more sheriff's officers and to hire more police in order to target the protesters who are trying to keep the Line 3 progress from happening. And so it's this just tremendously literal example of the way that a huge corporate capitalist interest is paying police to protect their property at the expense of human life in a very real, tangible way.
And I think also really complicates what we're talking about when we talk about safety, right? It's like the climate crisis is like such a huge existential threat to like all of our safety. And the water protectors and folks who are putting their bodies on the line are trying to keep us safe from like oil spills and huge like oil and gas corporations that are just like exploiting natural resources and indigenous land. And whose side are the police on?
Yes, whose side are the police on? Someone raised in the chat the situation that happened in Nova Scotia last year, where a white local fisherman attacked Indigenous fishermen, burned their vehicles, burned down their warehouse of lobsters, and the Canadian police stood by and did nothing. So what kind of a world can we build together where, well, that doesn't happen, but if it were to happen, who is there standing alongside, showing up with Indigenous folks in solidarity?
100%. And when that happened, this was, shortly after the commissioner of the RCMP had said that there was no systemic racism in the RCMP. And you can't fix something where people won't see what is happening. And I cannot agree more that so much of this comes back to property, and so much of it, which is of course wrapped up with capitalism, and then so much of it is just connected to the fact that we do not know our own histories, and we do not pay attention to the fact that all of this land that we are on has been stolen. And so where is the redress for that? What is happening in terms of, the calls to action from the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, have gone unaddressed. And there's a fundamental unwillingness to look at the structures that keep us in this place, which again speaks to, I think, what what everybody's been saying about the importance of using these terms that do push people to have these difficult conversations.
Great. The third part of that question was around how police enforce oppression against LGBTQ folks. I want to make sure we have time to answer that and also answer this last question that has come in the chat. So if we could do a quick round around that question, and then we can finish with the last question that's in the chat. So first, the policing and LGBTQ and Two-Spirit folks. Happy Pride Month. By the way, the first Pride was a riot against police brutality. Maybe we'll start with that.
Okay, I'll jump in. I mean, it's a terrible history. It's a horrific history. It's a horrific history everywhere, and it still is. And you know, trans folks are much more likely to be are also disproportionately likely to be killed and mistreated by police. And this continues. And we had a case recently in Toronto where gay men were disappearing and the cops had all the clues and did nothing. So this is it's outrageous, and they're not friendly to Black, Indigenous, trans people, people of color. Like if you're not white and straight, they're not friendly. And they're not necessarily on your side, and that is just the simple truth. And anybody who is queer, who is trans, will tell you these stories. They're not there to protect, and there have been so many cases of trans folk who have been killed or whose disappearance and murder has not been taken seriously by the police. That we should all recognize how serious an issue this is. It's not reformable.
I would just add the way that we as individuals reinforce that, and also how we as individuals prioritize in our responses. I'll just give an example of something that just happened it happened here this week. Last week, the county sheriff's office killed a Black man in his car. His name was Winston Smith, and they are refusing to. The sheriff's officers apparently had turned off their body cams. They're releasing no information. It's extremely suspicious. There's no footage. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension is refusing to release any information. There's a claim that this was U.S. Marshals who'd been deputized. There's a tremendous amount of what seems to be a cover-up happening here. And in the meantime, most people in other parts of the country have not heard of Winston Smith, who was murdered by police last week. And the street where he was murdered, it was painted by activists, like demanding to know answers. There was like red paint and a big message, a big mural in the street. Well, that was painted over by a group of community members, and they painted a rainbow over it. And they said, in honor of Pride Month, we want to see something beautiful in our streets. And it was this group of of residents saying, we don't want to see the ugliness of police accountability for a racist murder. We want to see something beautiful. And since it's Pride Month, that's a rainbow. And I just want to name the way that is pitting LGBTQ lives against Black lives in a really clear way, when we know that Black LGBTQ folks are at extreme additional risk. And so I do want to say that beyond like how the police engage with this, there is a community like throwing under the bus of certain groups when other groups perceive their own safety as being at risk.
Thank you so much for raising that, Carin. I've also witnessed things like that, and if we weren't close to time, I could tell some stories. But it speaks to the need for the community as a whole to protect one another, all of us together. And I think that comes then to the last question that we will address today, which is how do we acquire safety in Canada as Jewish citizens when our politicians are very lukewarm in calling out anti-Semitic acts as they occur, to the point that it almost seems to be acceptable?
Sorry, can I just, I'll take that, I'll mention that too, but I do want to mention,
Yep.
just in a follow-up to the previous question, that there is a reason that Black Lives Matter Toronto stopped the Pride Parade a couple of years ago, and like they just sat down in the middle of the intersection. Just some incredible activists from Black Lives Matter Toronto sat down in the intersection and basically refused to move until Pride Toronto agreed that the police would no longer be allowed to walk in the parade in uniform. And they did that precisely because it was so important to emphasize those intersections that Karen's talking about and that you're talking about, Reverend Ann. My experience of politicians in Canada is actually a very different one, that they fall all over themselves to talk about anti-Semitism, and that it's really important to them to talk about anti-Semitism. And I think it's far more important to them to talk about anti-Semitism than to talk about the way that systemic racism plays out, and far more and they have a lot of trouble talking about violence against trans people, for instance. But so I think that there's a much bigger issue in that politicians in Canada, again, to go back to this idea of white supremacy and this whole question of intersectionality. Like, I'll stand up at Queen's Park all the time to talk about intersectionality, because I think it's really important that people understand the way all these factors come together. But it's a hard battle to get them to understand it. So, but I'm not quite sure that I agree with the premise of the question there.
I don't have a tremendous amount of experience with Canadian politicians, but I do know that one thing that happens here in the US is is this desire for folks to call things out. We have to call it out. And I always just ask, like, what does that mean? Like, do you need someone to tweet? Do you need someone to send their office to send out a statement? Like, what is the thing that we need to see? And I think often it's just an acknowledgement of our pain and our fear. And that can look like a lot of different things. And, and often, I just saw there was a headline, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, in response to anti-Semitic violence, was deploying more state patrol, more state troopers to every synagogue in an area. And I feel like, well, that's calling out anti-Semitism, but I don't think that's the way, right? Like, for me, that doesn't mean safety, but he's named it. And so for me, it's a less about needing to call things out and needing leadership and public leadership to have an analysis of anti-Semitism and more broadly white supremacy, and what they should be doing, not just with the Jewish community, but with other targeted communities, to actually develop ways to get us all safer, in addition to calling out and naming the trauma that we're experiencing.
Hannah, do you have anything to add as a US person looking northwards?
Nothing to add. Nothing to add. My co-panelists are eloquent.
That is definitely true. The one thing I would add to that response is just in listening to all three of you respond to the whole thread of questions today, the importance of the community. We keep coming back to this. Politicians, with perhaps the exception of our esteemed Rima here, but generally politicians are kind of out for themselves and getting themselves reelected. And I think for me, one of the brilliant things that abolitionists offer to us is the imagination to imagine differently, and that we can learn or relearn or remember how to care for one another and keep one another safe, regardless of what the system beyond us is doing. And so that perhaps part of the answer is, well, who are our communities that we're aligned with, who can show up for us? Who are our neighbors who can show up for us, regardless of if my representative says the words I need him to say or not? Because in my experience, mostly they don't. So but the people around me will have my back. And that's what's going to matter most. So I want to thank each one of you, Hannah, Rima, Carin, thank you so much for your amazing wisdom and experience and presence that you've brought to us today. And thanks to all of you for staying with us this afternoon for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for your questions that provoked even more wonderful conversation. And Amy, I'm handing it to you to close us out today.
Well, I don't have much to add. Thank you again to Hannah, Rima, Carin, and Anne. Thank you, Rabbi Miriam. I thought this was an amazing conversation. I learned a lot. It's given me a lot to think about. I hope the same for everybody who attended. I hope you will continue to have these conversations about these topics with people in your lives. And yeah, we're going to figure out a way to compile these great resources that were put in the chat, as well as the best way to send out the recording of this, and yeah, just how to keep the conversation moving forward. So thank you again, and have a good rest of your Sunday.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Danforth, for being amazing hosts. It was great to hear from you all.